Welcome to a Facebook Live recording of the Greg Koford Books Authorcast. My name is Brian Whitney, and I am an editor and handle marketing for Greg Koford Books. For those of you who subscribe to the Greg Koford Books Authorcast, you'll still get this audio in your podcast feed, and we're also going to post this as a video up on our YouTube channel. My guest today is James McLachlan, and now you prefer Jim, right?
Either one.
Okay. I'll go with Jim.
You can call me Jimmy too if you want.
So Jim is a professor of philosophy and religion at Western Carolina University. He specializes in and writes about process theology, personalism, Schelling, and Mormon studies. Jim is a co-editor of Discourses in Mormon Theology, Philosophical and Theological Possibilities, and has contributed a chapter to Mormonism at the Crossroads of Philosophy and Theology, essays in honor of David L. Paulson. Along with his wife, Carrie, Jim is currently serving as a co-editor of Element, the Journal of the Society for Mormon Philosophy and Theology, or SMPT, as we'll be calling it throughout this interview. Greg Koford Books has recently partnered with SMPT as the publisher for Element, and its most recent issue for spring 2019 is now available at gregkoford.com, so you can go check it out. So today we are going to get to know Jim and discuss the history behind SMPT, also talk about their upcoming annual conference, the most recent issue of Element, and maybe if you stick around long enough at the end, we'll talk about why there seems to be a little ambivalence towards philosophy and theology among church members. So for any who join us live today on Facebook, feel free to post any questions that you might have as we go along, and we'll try to work them in. Jim, it's good to be with you.
Yeah, good to be with you.
So let's start with your background. Now, you were raised in Utah, right?
Yeah, I grew up in Taylorsville on a farm. Of course, you could never tell that now if you've been to Taylorsville. You know,
right.
We still own the old farmhouse out there that was built in 1885 by my great-grandfather for his second wife.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So they
second
were
of how many, Jim?
3.
Okay.
3. He didn't have a whole lot, but yeah, Margaret Naismith was my great-grandfather William McLachlan's second wife, and so they were out there. And eventually, we sold most of the farm except for the house and moved to Holiday. And I went to Olympus High School there. Swore I'd never go to BYU. Date a girl from BYU, or certainly not marry one. And I ended up, of course, after my mission, doing all 3.
So backing up a little bit to your family, sounds like pioneer stock.
Yeah, both ways. My great-grandfather, well, I had several pioneers back there. My great-grandfather, William, came out in 1863, converted. He's Scottish, but converted in England, sailed over on the Amazon, which is the ship that Charles Dickens describes in his little piece on the Mormons. He visited a Mormon immigrant ship. Unbeknownst to me and my wife, after we'd been married 2 years, we found out that her great-great-grandfather sailed over on the same ship.
Wow.
And, they did the trek across, lost 2 babies. My great-grandfather did, lost 2 babies outside of Council Bluffs, and ended up in Utah. And my mother, that's on my father's side, my mother actually grew up in Bloomfield, New Jersey in the 1930s. And when she was about 12, she found a Book of Mormon in the library in Bloomfield, read it, and converted to the church, waited 9 years to join until she was 21, and then came out to Utah and ran into my dad.
Interesting.
They got married.
So 1860s, and you said that they did the trek across. Were they able to do that by train at that point, or did they have to hoof it?
They hoofed it from Iowa to Utah.
Oh, okay.
The transcontinental doesn't get completed until 1869. So, yeah, they weren't hand carts; they were wagon. But they hoofed it that far. I have some others that also hooked it, but different things. We Mormons do genealogy, and you run into these people. Okay.
Was he able to take advantage of the perpetual emigration funds, or did he pay for the whole thing himself?
I should know that.
Yeah,
but I don't.
Yeah.
My mother, who died a few years ago, would have, if she would have been listening to this podcast, would have severely chastised me at this point.
For not knowing that detail.
Yeah, my mother was a real avid genealogist. I mean, she wrote a 2,000-page book on her Swope ancestors, and then she wrote one on the McLachlans. She did a lot of stuff.
Interesting.
So she knew all this stuff, and she actually wrote a biography for her master's thesis in family history at BYU, which won an award. But it was on William McLachlan, and I have it. And I read it 30 years ago, but I haven't read it since. So, like I say, my mom would, if she's in, the other side right now, I'm going to have a visitation, and she's going to be ticked off.
Sounds like there could be a future biography in the works too, with all the stuff that's been written and collected, right?
Yeah.
Great. So how important was Mormonism to your family line then?
Really important. Yeah, my mother and father, my father left on his mission to the northwestern states on December 7th, 1941.
Okay.
They bombed Pearl Harbor,
right,
and was up there for 2.5 years, and then came back and joined the Merchant Marine, and was in World War II. My mother, as I said, was a convert, and this, it was kind of the glue that held together everything. But it was also, and this is true, I think, of a lot of people, a kind of family religion. I always held the opinion that Mormonism is a type of ancestor veneration, and God's just back there further. Mom and Dad God are just back there further.
Right. Yeah. No, I definitely see. I mean, it's definitely focused on kinship, right, and generations. More so after Wilford Woodruff really changed us over from the idea of being a lateral thing to exactly. To a up and down thing. It really started the Utah Genealogical Society. But yeah, I mean, it transformed the religion, right?
Yeah.
And I think, in my opinion, for the better.
Yeah, well, and two, that's a tension that goes all the way back, because when Joseph introduced his work for the Dad, people were incredibly excited about the idea. And, we
day and night out in the Mississippi, right?
Yeah.
Baptize them all. Yeah, definitely. So you said you served a mission. I'm going to jump back into your story here. You served a mission. Okay. Where was that?
Well, I was. I'm a bit different than most people who tell their stories, in that I had severe doubts about Mormonism when I left on my mission. My dad was he worked out at Kennecott Copper on the dike. Yeah. And it was like the sweetest man you ever met. I mean, he's just kind, nice person. I mean, then my mother, she was wonderful too. But I remember my dad, I was having all these doubts. My dad looked at me and he said, Jimmy, you don't have to go if you don't want to. And, he just looked into his eyes, and I remember thinking to myself, hell, now I have to go. He was such a sweet guy. I couldn't break his heart. He didn't say this was an obligation. You have to go. He says, you don't have to go. And, you just kind of, you know how that works. And I was a history major at the time, and I wanted to become a labor lawyer, for the unions. And, but I went to France. And how can you go to, I get called to the Geneva, Switzerland mission, which was mostly in France. But how can you go to France and not get into philosophy? I mean, it's just almost impossible. People just talk about it. Right. And I was reading Sartre. I had a great mission president. I could read anything I wanted as long as I did it in French and did it on Fridays, which was P-Day. And so I was reading Sartre, and somebody told me to read Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the German Protestant theologian. And I was, 20 by that time, and didn't know better. And all I could remember, Bonhoeffer's a hard name to remember. And all I could remember was it began with a B, and the person had died heroically in World War II. So I get my little Roos Dictionary of Philosophy, and I'm going through it, and I run across this philosopher, Henri Bergson. And Bergson actually ends the last book that he wrote, The Two Sources of Morality and Religion, with the line that the universe is a machine for creating gods. And my little Mormon mind, just, how kids are. And so and Bergson had died heroically in World War II. He was Jewish, but wanted to convert to Christianity, but remained Jewish because of what was happening. He didn't go to the camps. He died of pneumonia. This was a guy who won the Nobel Prize in Literature. Not too many philosophers do that. And so, I got into Bergson on my mission and came back and wanted to do philosophy and studied philosophy at BYU. Kind of did both history and philosophy. I have a master's degree in history from Indiana University, but then I went up to the University of Toronto so I could do both history and philosophy together. My PhD is actually in religious studies, where I majored in Western religious thought and had a history of Christianity minor. So
Okay. What was your plans to do with those, with both history and philosophy? What were you hoping to? Were you hoping to go back to BYU and teach?
Yeah, sorta. I actually taught there for a year. In 1988-89, and I had some great teachers when I was there. Jim Faulkner in the philosophy department, Cody Carter. I actually never took a class from David Paulson, which I really regret because I got to be really good friends with him.
And now you have an essay in honor of him.
Yeah, in the book with you guys. And well, Doug Tobler in the history department. There were just some wonderful people there. So I went off and did my PhD, came back, taught at BYU for a year. And then it was just a year appointment. So I got this job at Western Carolina thinking that I would be back in the West in 2 or 3 years. And that was 30 years ago.
So you think you might be staying out there for a little while longer?
Yeah. And I'm happy to be here. It's in a lot of ways, it's easier to be a Mormon outside of Zion than it is inside Zion. Although it depends how you talk about Zion. My dad always used to call it the dead center of Zion, right. Salt Lake City. And I go, yeah, the dead center.
Now, you're in the philosophy department?
We're actually, this is the South. Okay. So it's you only find these things in the South. There's a few of them in other places, but at small universities, you have philosophy and religion together. Yeah. And that's why they hired me, because I could do both.
Okay. So for those who are joining us, we're talking to Jim McLachlan, co-editor of Element Journal, which is the journal for the Society of Mormon Philosophy and Theology. And so today we're going to be discussing the latest issue of Element Journal, the upcoming conference for SMPT, and we're going to be talking a little bit about the history and background. So first, we're just getting to know Jim a little bit and what his story is. For anybody who has any comments or questions as we go through, feel free to toss them out, and we'll try to incorporate them into the interview as we go. So let's get into what areas you mostly focus on in your personal writing of philosophy. When I did my introduction of you, I threw out a few terms that may be a little confusing for a lot of people.
Let's see, how to explain this? I like the history of philosophy a lot, and the history, particularly the history of philosophy of religion. My main areas are probably contemporary, well, by contemporary, up to 1960. Well,
In
maybe.
philosophy, that's contemporary, considering
Yeah,
its ancient roots, right?
yeah. Well, I can get past that. I work on French philosophy of religion, especially the French Jewish philosopher Emmanuel Levinas, who some people may have heard of, and if they haven't heard of him, go out and buy a book right away. He's one of the most important philosophers of the 20th century, and there are several people at BYU who are also interested in him. In Bergson, of course, which I still have a real passion for him. I wrote my dissertation on Jean-Paul Sartre, who's an atheist. Came to me in priesthood meeting. Sartre, in Being and Nothingness, says the basic human motivation is the desire.
Was that a reflection on the lesson that day?
Yes, it was. He says the basic human motivation is the desire to be God, which is pretty dark, actually. We all desire to kind of control things, and we do this in a million ways. And so I was sitting there thinking, is there a way we can think about this in other ways than not climbing the corporate ladder of divinity? And so I wrote my dissertation on Sartre and a Russian Orthodox theologian named Nikolai Bergayev, who I think would also be interesting for Mormons. But Bergayev got me interested in mysticism. So did Bergson. And so I've written on Jakob Berma, who was a 17th century German mystic, and who I think, if people read him, they would see real echoes to Mormonism. He was somebody who ended up in a lot of popular religious writing in both, certainly in Germany and Russia, but also in England and America. And in fact, one of Berma's writings was one of the first things published in the American colonies. Aldous Huxley once said of Berma, though, reading Berma is like going to he was a 17th century German, I guess I should throw that in. Reading Berma is like going to a picnic. He brings the words and you bring the meaning. So it's a little bit like that. But that's what got me. You mentioned Schelling. And if people read my essay on Paulson, it's about Schelling and Mormonism. Schelling was a 19th century German romantic idealist.
Okay,
and
why don't you define that for listeners? A romantic idealist.
Okay,
I mean, I have a sense of what that is, but you know, we think of romance, we think of the romance genre of love.
Yeah. If you think of romanticism as a movement in 19th century literature and philosophy and poetry, you think of people like William Blake, who was also inspired by Jakob Berma. You think of romantic music, kind of a la, sort of Beethoven, but especially people like Robert Schumann and Hector Berlioz in France. You think of writers like the poet Novalis or Victor Hugo. Romanticism goes for a long time, but it was
really a reaction against the sort of the Enlightenment wave, right? Of the scientific Enlightenment, right? This concept of it's that internally is where we gather our truth and things like that. Right? Can you?
Well, when you think of things like the Quakers, I mean, they happened long before Romanticism, but you have this idea of some kind of inner light. Mormons call it a testimony. Okay,
or the light of the spirit, right?
Light of the spirit, that somehow resonates within us as we come close to truth. And what I liked about people like Schelling was the notion that God needed the world. It's kind of like the Beatles, or no, it's Grace Slick and Jefferson Airplane. Don't you want somebody to love? That God, in order to love, has to have an other, and the other is us. The great image of romantics, this is also the period when Shakespeare becomes popular again, both in Germany and in the English-speaking world. And one of the things they loved about Shakespeare was, that the comedies all end with marriage. And so you get this image of marriage as the basic Christian mystery of the unity of how two people become one and yet remain two.
Right.
So you get unity and diversity at the same time. And what's important for here, kind of for theology, is that it's no longer an idea of a kind of great shade of being with God on the top and us on the bottom. It's a marriage. And this is an old idea. It's one of the reasons why the Song of Solomon was the most popular book in the Middle Ages. But yeah, that's out there. The other thing I do is called process theology.
Yeah. So tell me about process theology. And again, that's a term that I'm familiar with, but I think for a lot of listeners that may not be a familiar term. So
yeah, it's associated. Excuse me. Yeah, it's associated with Schelling, this German philosopher I do, but also with the English mathematician Alfred North Whitehead,
right,
and with Henri Bergson, the French philosopher I talked about. But it's a notion that time is real. Too often, when we Mormons talk about eternity, we're usually talking about endless time. But when you talk to someone else, outside of Mormon tradition about eternity, you're, like with somebody who reads St. Augustine, it's timelessness. It's, or at least the idea that past, present, and future are all combined in God who sees the whole thing at once. This gives you tremendous problems with free will because we get predestination if God has perfect knowledge of everything, like looking at a painting or knowing the end of the movie when he sits down in it. It rewards comfort because the thing's going to come out all right. But still, it's difficult to think about anything like adventure or freedom. What process philosophy does, and this spills over into what's called process theology, is to take time as a kind of basic reality, even for God, that we're all involved in this. Time is what is real. And so it's a real, David Paulson used to write about this. It's a real adventure, but it's also a real risk.
Yeah.
Because you don't know how this story is going to turn out.
Right. Would this mean then that God ages?
Well, God's immortal. So are we. Yeah, there's a sense in which God ages. That's an interesting question because nobody's ever asked me that before. There's a sense in which God ages, but there's a sense in which God, and this is the old argument that Mormons had for a long time. I just wrote an article for a book on this. Do we believe that God learns new things, or do we believe that God knows everything?
Right.
And that one's never been solved for us. But here, this would be more the Brigham Young side, Eugene England side. That God learns new stuff.
Right.
Maybe it's not abstract new stuff, but it's new stuff. When a kid gets born, that's a new experience of the world that God's never had before.
I would assume that to answer the question, does God age? We would first have to define what does aging mean.
Yeah.
Right? And, because for us, aging is entropy. Right?
Yeah.
It's the breakdown of our cells and our bodies. And so if that doesn't happen within deity, if there's no breakdown of cells and things like that, then aging is a completely different concept.
Well, that's a good way to think about it too, because you think about Genesis chapter 1, and the way Joseph Smith reads that, that and the way early Mormons read it, it's not creation ex nihilo, it's not creation from nothing. God's not sitting outside the world. God's involved in time because God creates from the chaos. And if anything, what you said about entropy is God is in a constant struggle with chaos. Right. Trying to bring order from the chaos. I love this reading of Job that reads when, God just kind of yells at Job there, when Job finally gets to talk to the guy, and God just sort of yells at him, is that God is not just, I am so cool and you're nothing. The universe is a hell of a mess and I'm doing the best I can. Have some empathy here. Although, I do have problems.
What my day was like.
Yeah. And if you look at it that way, it makes the idea that Jehovah is Jesus, this Mormon idea, makes a little more sense, because here's God up there, trying to keep the order going, and starts yelling at poor old Job, who's just been through hell. And then he comes down, realizes how difficult this is, because he gets crucified. Goes through Gethsemane, he gets crucified, fasts for 40 days, whatever that means. And then, talks to Joseph Smith about this in section 122 and goes, hell yeah, it's tough. Didn't realize that one before.
Right. Yeah, I knew it was going to be rough, but man, oof. All right. So you defined process theology and process philosophy a little bit here, but you also threw out a couple of other terms of personalism.
Personalism.
So what is personalism?
Personalism is not the most popular philosophy in the world right now, but at one time it was. One person who I write about and who got me into philosophy was a guy named William H. Chamberlain. Mm-hmm. William Chamberlain was the first Mormon to do formal studies in philosophy. And he went out to the University of California at Berkeley, and I write about these guys as well as Chamberlain. But he studied with a guy, a personalist philosopher named George Holmes Howison, who wrote a book called The Limits of Evolution. Evolution is a big, important part of both process and personalism. But in it, where he talks about what he called the city of God and the true God at its head. But the idea is that God is actually a community of persons interacting with each other. Okay, so I've heard this concept of collective consciousness. Yeah. It's related to an idea that the ultimate reality is the moral relations between persons. The most famous personalist theologian is Martin Luther King. King, the kind of, Howison was at Berkeley. Josiah Royce was a colleague of William James at Harvard. But personalism really takes off at Boston University with a guy named Gordon Parker Bown and then another guy named Edgar Sheffield Brightman. And Brightman was King's, if you want one philosopher who really influenced King, it's Brightman. He went to Boston U to study with Brightman. Unfortunately, Brightman died after he'd been there only a year. But King himself developed a really interesting kind of take on personalism as the ultimate value of is persons, no matter what race, no matter gender, all that stuff. So if you're looking for the kind of most famous personalist theologian, it's King.
And it reminds me also of the notion from Les Miserables that God is on other people, right? Yeah. Which was something that was expressed to me by a Jewish rabbi, not knowing that it came from Les Miserables, but that had a profound effect on me personally, and it really shifted my notion of what the divine relationship really is. Yeah, there's a real profound personalist movement or stream in Judaism, especially in the 20th century, with people like Martin Buber. Wrote his famous book I and Thou, which is a real kind of personalist book. We approach the world either as an it, or we approach other people either as its that we manipulate, as things, or as thous, real others. And then the guy I was talking about before, Emmanuel Levinas, I think one of the greatest philosophers of the 20th century, and he's also a personalist. Okay. So just to help listeners keep on track with this, in a very strong nutshell, we talked about romanticism, which again, reaction to the scientific Enlightenment movement, the notion that truth comes from within. process theology, the notion that time is an actual thing, and that that this idea of this construct of eternity also would include real time. And now we talked about personalism. Go ahead.
Could I break in just because I want to do a plug for an issue of Element we did with you folks?
Yeah.
I think it's volume 6. It was the first issue we did with Kofod. Is an issue on process theology.
Great.
And we have essays in there by David Paulson, by Robert Mesley, who's Community of Christ, but also has written several books on process theology, and by several other people. So it's a nice issue, and you can get it from Kofod Books.
Great. And some more familiar names that people may be familiar with who tend towards process theology would be like Dan Witherspoon, for instance.
Oh yeah, Dan did his PhD at Claremont, which is the center of process theology in the United States.
Right. I would say Terrell Givens leans towards process theology in a lot of his writing.
Yeah,
so
I would agree.
It's
which, by the way, there's another plug for Element and Kofod Books. The previous issue, issue 7, is on the theology of Terrell Givens.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, we have essays in there by Adam Miller.
I work for the company. I should know that.
Yeah, we have an essay in there by Adam Miller, another one by Rosalind Welch, Ben Huff, and I've got one in there too. And then Terrell responds to all of us. So
that seems to be a pretty typical format. And I was actually going to save this to later, but since you brought it up, that seems to be a pretty typical format among you philosopher types, is to have a journal or even a conference panel or session dedicated to one person's writings, responding to them, and then kind of finishing with their response to everybody else. Kind of this back and forth between everybody. Creating this dialogue. Is that an accurate summary of what philosophy are like?
Yes and no. Okay. Yes, in that you often see that. Like the first 2 issues we did with Kofod, the first one was on process theology, and so it was just a group of different people writing about process.
That one was thematic, right?
Yeah, that one was thematic. The next one we did with you folks was called Open Theism. There's a kind of, if you look at open theism tends to be, process theology tends to be more liberal. Open theism, somewhat more conservative, but still not conservative. Okay. And we have.
So who are some familiar names within Mormonism that may embrace open theism? I'm assuming contributors to that.
Yeah, we've got David Paulson in both issues.
Okay.
But I'm trying to think.
Blake Ostler, for instance, would he?
Blake. Yeah, Blake walks the narrow ridge there too. But I would think Blake would be closer to open theism, because in open theism you still have this idea of the difference of God from the rest of us.
Right.
And if you read Exploring Mormon Thought, and that's just, I agree with Blake on like 90% of the stuff, but right there, he's just wrong. Okay. Okay. And we've had this argument for a long time. Yeah. So we've got some essays in there by Mormons, but also by Richard Mao, who had this really long conversation with Bob Millett at BYU. It's a nice issue. So those are thematic, and then we have the 2 that we've done recently, one with Terrell Givens, and now this one with Taylor Petrie.
Okay, so great. Let's not dive into the journal too far yet. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. But one more term that I just wanted to briefly explain for people is existentialism. So if you could just define that quickly, then we'll move on to talking about SMPT. Yeah,
I've spent most of my life with that. Existentialism.
Don't we all?
What? Yeah. Well, the most famous definition, the most famous existentialist was, of course, Jean-Paul Sartre, who was a famous atheist philosopher in the mid-20th century. And he's one of my heroes. I think there's a God. He didn't, but he defined it in a famous lecture he gave called "Existentialism as a Humanism," where he said existentialism is the idea that existence precedes essence. Which, if we talk about free will, because existentialism is all about human freedom, it's the idea that, and this is why Sartre thought there could not be a God, because he couldn't imagine another kind of God, in which, let's see, this pen, ta-da, its essence precedes its existence. We've got a plan for making a pen before we ever make the pen. Okay. So, and Sartre argued that if we believe in God, and this really goes to the idea of creation ex nihilo, God designs each one of us and then puts us into the world. So we're predestined for heaven or hell and everything that goes on in our lives. Whereas he says, no, we're more like thrown into the world. I grew up in Utah, we used to say when a calf was born that a cow threw a calf. So you're thrown into the world. You don't choose where you're born. You don't choose your parents. But then you start looking around and start trying to figure out what you're doing, kind of creating order from chaos that's your life. So you're creating your essence. This is what he called your project as you go. And what's interesting about existentialism, a lot of people will think of the famous existentialists like Albert Camus and Jean-Paul Sartre and think, oh, it's an atheist philosophy. But there were a whole lot of religious existentialists. Soren Kierkegaard is probably the most famous. He was a theist. But Martin Buber is considered an existentialist. He's a personalist. A guy named Gabriel Marcel, a Catholic philosopher, was an existentialist. So Levinas starts out as kind of an existentialist. So there are as many religious existentialists as there were atheist existentialists. It's just the idea that existence, you exist first and then you create your meaning as you're going on, even in relation with God. God's in the existential mix.
The phrase that comes to my mind is tabula rasa, the idea of being born a blank slate, right? And then everything is added on after, throughout life experiences, socialization, things that that form your identity, all comes from that blank slate forward, and not not necessarily bringing in this template, right? This Plato's cave template in with you. I think it's an interesting question, particularly given our research now on genetic predisposition and things like that, like that there does seem to be this transference from creator to creation, and I'm talking parents to children, of these genetic markers that may affect their psychology, may affect their behavior, may affect their
Sartre, it's not exactly a blank slate. Sartre talked about what he called our facticity. So we all come into the world with all sorts of predilections, but then we're here. It's kind of like because these guys were big champions of free will, and you can't have free will if you don't have what he called facticity, because then you're just in the chaos. So it's kind of a blank slate, but it's not a blank slate because there's all this stuff that you come in, that you're thrown into. You're thrown into this situation. You've got all these tendencies in you as well. And yet, from a practical point of view, just living a life, nobody can live thinking that everything's decided for him already. We all have to act like we're free. When we walk in,
more of a rejection of determinism.
When we walk into a restaurant and we look at the menu, we have these. This is a really superficial reading of an existential choice. But haven't you ever sat in a restaurant and go, I don't know what I want?
After a while, right?
your genes aren't going to tell you.
Right. But at the same time, your choices are limited to what's on you. So you don't have this wide berth of endless possible choices, right? So there is some determinism going on there in that what's actually available on the menu, right?
Yeah, and you think about, somebody who is born with, because one of the things that comes up across in this issue is Taylor is talking about, how do we approach in the church homosexuality? And if we think that it's just a choice, that, you could do whatever you want, that seems to be a kind of denial of the reality out there that a lot of people are experiencing. And over the last, 10, 20 years, I think the church itself has come to that position. When I was a kid, I didn't even know gay was a possibility until I was 20. I guess it wasn't out there. But still, you have somebody who's gay is thrown into the world with a whole, and if they're Mormon, with a whole section of choices. How are they going to deal with this situation? What are they going to do? Are they going to leave? Are they going to stay? And it's a difficult choice. That's what I think existentialism really is. It's a way to help us recognize the incredible difficulty of a life that requires a lot of choices. And one of the things, and this is what Sartre called it, inauthenticity, is to run away and pretend they aren't there. Okay. Like I always tell my students when I'm teaching this, there's a certain point when I'm writing a paper where I bring up solitaire on my screen because I want to escape. I don't want to think about it or I start cleaning my room, because it's these choices, often we want to avoid them. We want to think that they're made for us already. And there are certain limitations, but we still have to choose.
Right. Let's move into SMPT, the Society for Mormon Philosophy and Thought. Now, let's talking about its earliest incarnation before it was even an official organization or even called SMPT. It was an ancient relic of the internet.
Listservs.
Right, back in 1995. Now, I know that any listeners to this podcast are probably going to be millennial generation below, and they've never known a day without social media. So tell me a little bit about what listserv was and what the name of the group was at that time.
Yeah, you see, I way back in 1995, Kelly Potter, who teaches at Utah Valley, was a graduate student at Notre Dame. And he started this thing called LDS Phil. And it was a listserv. A listserv was something that you got in email. And email was pretty primitive. And somebody would say something, then, it's kind of like a place where Facebook fights can happen. Okay. Nowadays, because
it sounds like a chain letter.
Yeah, it's a little bit like that. And somebody would put it out there, and everybody in the group would get it, and then they would respond. And sometimes you had really fruitful conversations, and other times it was, just people yelling at each other, just like they do on Facebook. So
human nature doesn't change.
A really early incarnation of social media.
Okay. How many people jumped on saying, "Who's this Phil guy?" Are we talking?
I don't remember anybody doing that.
No, I assume that people who signed up for it knew
what, yeah. And so we would have discussions of, there were a lot of people on it that people might recognize, like Dan Peterson and Kelly Potter and Blake Ostler and and we would sometimes have some pretty interesting discussions. But eventually that morphed in, let's see if I can, I'm looking at the SMPT website so I can remember how this happened.
2003.
There was.
started meeting at Yale Divinity, right?
Yeah, there was a meeting at Yale Divinity. I didn't go to that because I didn't have enough money to go up there for a Mormon meeting. My university kind of expected me to do, other stuff when I went to meetings.
Legitimate, right?
Yeah. Even though it was a Yale Divinity School.
Right.
But it was an interesting meeting. Dave Paulson was there. I think Blake Ostler was there. Potter was there. It was an interesting group of people that got together there back in 2003.
That was the official creation of the society, right?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, that's what it says here. The society was formed March 28, 2003 at Yale Divinity. And then a few years later, next year, we started a meeting at Utah Valley University and got organized with an executive board, and the thing kind of went from there. Element was established by Potter first as an online journal. And then Brian Birch, also at Utah Valley, picked it up and edited the first, I think, five issues. Yeah. And then we had some big changes, and he pitched it to me. Now, we went through a kind of the wilderness after I got it, because
the dark ages, is that what we can
do? Dark ages, because he had funding there at Utah Valley. Western Carolina wasn't about to give me a dime for this, so it took several years to get it up and running again, and we did that by developing an online presence at my university. That went away, so it's not there now. We're working on getting it back, but also getting the partnership with you folks at Koford Books, which really saved the journal, I think.
Yeah.
So it's
there is still a website, SMPT.org. It seems to be a little out of date, but there are still some things that are posted on it. For instance, the upcoming conference dates are on the front page.
Yeah.
I did see that, but sounds to me like these things are kind of ramping back up now that you've got
we've got you, and we were also creating a web page where they can get kind of like Dialogue is open now to all their back issues. We're opening up a web page where you can get all the back issues of the journal for no charge. It's we had it before, and then the consortium our university backed out of the consortium, and it went away. But we should have the web page up within the next couple of months. We've got it pretty well built, but we have a few other things to do. And my technical skills are very limited, so I'm working with some IT people at my university to get this thing up and going. And they have jobs, and so they're not always available to help me figure this out. But it's getting there. But you, like I say, I think all the issues of the journal are available from Koford, if I remember right.
Yeah, I mean, if you go to gregkoford.com and if you look up Element, I think we may even have it on our front page now. But if you don't, you can just type Element into the search box. Yeah, I don't see it on the front page yet. But if you type Element into the search box, that'll pull it up. And what you'll get is a page where you can select the issue that you're interested in. There's just a little drop down box next to the issued number, and you can just select that and scroll down through it. So, and it will pull up the front cover of the image when you select it, so you can see who's contributed to that issue.
Yeah, and I think a couple of people have said that it is, I mean, Dialogue's great, Sunstone's great, Mormon Studies Review is great, but a lot of people have said this is the best place to go for Mormon theology.
Right.
Because a lot of the, Dialogue does literature, social science. Every once in a while you get a theology article. Sunstone very rarely does a theology article.
Yeah.
This is where, if you want to read Mormon philosophy and theology, this is the place.
Yeah, I would say that this is for the for the deeper philosophy nerds for sure, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, Dialogue is it's a journal of Mormon thought broadly, and it's multidisciplinary, which is fantastic, right? We need that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Open access, it's wonderful. Sunstone is definitely more cultural topics, right? They get into you're going to get into current affairs and things like that with them. But this is really a journal that's geared strictly for those who really like chewing on the deep philosophy and theology topics like existentialism, like personalism, and like process theology, all of these things that are really meaty and chewy. And then similarly, I think one of the strengths of Element, and again, we'll talk about it in a second, is this idea of responding to somebody else's theology, some of their writings and things like that, and having an opportunity for people to look at it from different angles, right, and focus on that for an entire issue. That's something that you don't get in any other kind of journal, really. But getting back to the society itself, any idea anymore how many members there are?
I know at a certain point we it's just kind of open. We've got this is once again one of the things we have to rebuild.
Right.
About 2010, we went through a kind of evolutionary moment where the organization had a kind of tendency toward entropy, as you were saying. Okay. And so right now we don't really have a membership list. Anybody can participate in it who wants to. What we have to do, as you were noting, the web page is a little out of date. We have to bring all those things back to date. And hopefully, one of the things that we'll be able to accomplish at this meeting this week at the next week at the University of Utah is take some big steps toward bringing that all back. And right now, you don't. If you want to come to the meeting, there's no charge. It's free. The journal, we'll have a few copies there at the meeting. You can buy for like $5. I don't know what Cofer charges for them, but you'd probably charge a little more than that on. If you want to participate in the group, you just look for the call for papers when it comes out, and you send something in, and it's vetted all by professional philosophers. So we're looking for some
you guys have an email or anything like that? People can sign up to get notifications on anything?
I wish we did. We'll have to do that too. There's a lot of just kind of that nuts and bolts work that has to be done.
Right.
The problem with philosophers, the old story of Thales walking along, looking at the stars, and then falling in a well. That happens. Or my favorite one about Aristophanes wrote this play, The Clouds. That the old joke about philosophers is they live in the clouds. This is where it comes from, is from Aristophanes' play. Aristophanes and Socrates did not like each other. Aristophanes is really funny. So Aristophanes makes fun of Socrates in this play, The Clouds, and later Plato's going to pay him back by making fun of him in the Symposium. But Socrates is walking along, the street, looking up in the air with his mouth open, and Aristophanes says, and a lizard was sitting on the top of a building, and it befouled his mouth. So it let loose, and as Aristophanes says, that's a great thought was lost. Now Aristophanes has a point here. Philosophers could get their day-to-day life skills down a little better than that.
So sounds like a business manager might help, right?
Really. If you're out there, contact me. I'll give you my email. You can send it to me. Right.
I mean, but let's stay in the clouds for just a minute longer, because
sure. I like the clouds. It's,
I mean, like, what are some of the big philosophical questions that you see being? Well, this is a two-part question. So first off, what are some of the big philosophical questions that you're seeing become trendy, for the lack of a better word, right now? And then has that shifted over time?
Oh yeah. Are you talking about generally or in Mormonism?
No, I'm talking about within Mormonism specifically.
Within
Let's narrow
Mormonism.
it down a little bit.
Well, I think if you get this issue, and another plug for the journal here, you can see that happening. And if you look at all four of the issues we've done, this one would be the most cutting edge. Okay, process theology has been around for a long time. Okay, that's the first issue, but it's still going. It's still kind of cutting edge. A lot of feminists write process theologians. A lot of LGBT people use process theology. Open theism's been around for 20 or 30 years. And it's arguable that we could trace it back further, but that's been its big moment. It's still there. It's the idea that God is open to the future. Okay. People want to read a nice short book that is really available to people about open theism. I recommend Tom Ord, who's not a Mormon. He teaches up in Idaho taught up in Idaho at Northwest Nazarene, called The Uncontrolling Love of God, or his more recent book, God Can't. And we're going to actually be doing the next issue of Element, Mormon responses to Tom. Okay. The Terrell Givens issue. Terrell is if I were to pick one person writing Mormon theology nowadays, I think there's some really interesting people: Jim Faulconer, Adam Miller, Joe Spencer, Blake Ostler. But I would pick Terrell as my favorite because he does it the way I do it. He's interested in the history of ideas, and
right.
And so he's, if you read Wrestling the Angel, that's what you get. Or if you read his book, it's not specifically about Mormonism, When Souls Had Wings, which I wrote a big, long review of for Dialogue a long time. Because there's a couple of things with Terrell I disagree with, but it's still, I think it's amazing stuff. It's global, in that he talks about big questions. It's like there's a famous book by a guy named Arthur O. Lovejoy called The Great Chain of Being. It's kind of that kind of focused book, but it's not what you would call cutting edge stuff. Okay,
right. That's like you said, more the history of philosophy.
Yeah, it's more of a traditional way of approach.
Develop.
Yeah.
The one thing I'll say about Terrell is that he has a tremendous gift for being able to take complex ideas to a broad audience.
Oh yeah,
right?
yeah. I think Wrestling with God is. I really like Phil Barlow's Mormons in the Bible. This type of book that takes this to a kind of broad audience. But I think Wrestling with God is probably my favorite Mormon book of the last 30 years. If I, it'd be up there with Rough Stone Rolling. It's it's a great book. Now, but if you're talking about kind of cutting edge philosophical stuff in Mormonism, I think what we're doing in this last issue is probably where that would be it, because these are all guys who are post-structuralist, postmodernist, feminist, Rosalind, Taylor, and they're taking on a really important issue. This is
which is you might as well introduce that now.
Yeah. Let me bring it up just so I can get the titles right here. So the title of Taylor's essay, which was given at the conference a couple of years ago, and we did a conference at Claremont School of Theology, is Theorizing Critical Mormon Biblical Studies. This is not going to sound exciting, but it really is if you think about it. Theorizing Critical Mormon Biblical Studies, Romans 1:18-32. Okay.
Okay.
Now, what I think is fascinating in this essay is, if people can think about what happens in Romans 1:18-32, that's probably the justification passage that most people will, most conservative Christians will use against the idea of extending fellowship and full fellowship to homosexuals, lesbians, gay and lesbian people, transgender, all that. And so the argument that's going on in this issue is about that. How do we think about that? How do we think about that passage where Paul talks about these issues? I like, and so we've got Taylor, and then responding to him, Jim Faulkner. His essay is a response to Taylor Petrie's theorizing critical Mormon biblical studies. Okay, well, that's that. Rosalind.
Philosophers aren't fantastic at titles, I have to tell you. That
every once in a while
the catchiness factor is kind of
hold on. I have a title for a book on the devil called Satan, Romantic Hero or Just Another Asshole. So I was so proud of that.
Okay, that might sell a copy or two.
Yeah. But yeah, the other ones are like, that. And then Taylor, well, we've got Adam Miller and Joe Spencer, and then Taylor responds. So, but let me just read one little bit of this, if I can find it, that sets up the problem for people. He looks at the passage in Romans, and Taylor's expertise is antiquity, right? So that's what he's talking about. He talks about the various ways that Mormons approach this passage. He talks about, Dan Peterson and Paul Hoskisson and, Brown, I forget Brown's first name, all people at BYU. He talks about the New Testament commentary. What?
That wasn't Sam Brown, was it?
Not Sam Brown. He's in the BYU religion department.
Okay.
And I've known him, interesting guy, really bright guy, but I can't remember his first name right now. And the way he describes these, let's see, at any other moment I could find this, is we have historical foundationism, and that would be people like in the BYU religion department, Kent Brown, that's it, S. Kent Brown. Like Dan Peterson, Paul Hoskisson, and S. Kent Brown. Now they're, historical foundationalism, he's going to say that's very, that's diverse. These are not people saying the same things, but the basic argument is that the scriptures are historically correct. That we can trust what's there. Okay. The other type of foundationalism that he describes, he calls theological foundationalism, and that would be Jim Faulkner, Adam Miller, Joe Spencer, and others. And that's the notion. This is interesting from somebody who's really an expert in Hellenistic religion of late antiquity, right? Where Christianity emerges, Judaism really as we know it kind of emerges. But you get all these kind of allegorical interpretations of Scripture. So you read Scripture through theology. A really famous example of that would be Philo of Alexandria. And we all, this is a kind of Platonist notion. Although I'm sure Jim, Adam, and Joe would all say, well, no, we're not Platonists. But still, there's a similarity here because what Philo said, and anybody who's taken an English class has run into this, is that when we read a story, like say Moby Dick, there's the most superficial level is the level of plot. The deeper level is the moral. And at the deepest level, there may be what we call the metaphysical meaning, the ultimate meaning. And you get this all over the place. I mean, in the Middle Ages, readings of the Song of Songs which was the most popular scriptural text probably in the Middle Ages, because it's on the face of it, it's just erotic love poetry. It was the first. When I was a kid, this was the first scriptures I actually read because somebody said that was what it was about. And it is. It's great erotic love poetry. But in the Middle Ages, you get this allegorical reading that, no, this is really about the love, and it's a beautiful reading, about the love of God for the world, the love of God for the soul. You really wonderful texts by Bernard of Clairvaux, Saint Bonaventure, Therese of Lisieux later, you go into medieval mysticism and you find it all over the place. Of course, these guys aren't doing that, but they're doing more cutting edge kind of postmodern, post-structuralist stuff. Okay, because so after existentialism goes away in the 1950s and 60s, you have the emergence of structuralism and then post-structuralism. People might know the names of people like Jacques Derrida or Michel Foucault, where you kind of take things apart. Now, Adam, Jim, and Joe are all doing something post-structuralist with the scriptures, but what Taylor says is they're still playing a kind of idea that what's important in the scriptures is this theological foundation, kind of like what we were talking about there with allegorical reading of scriptures. So that's different than, say, what Paul Hoskisson and Dan Peterson are doing, trying to say, oh, there's a historical foundation here. This story is going on very much at a kind of literal level. Here we have a kind of more theological reading. And so if I can find the passage I'm looking for, this is going to really, I think, hopefully make sense. And normally I could do this. Oh, here it is. This is what I want. Okay, so we have the passage in the Bible, Romans 1, 18 to 32. And maybe what I should do is just, I'm not going to read all of 18 and 32, but just let me read the passage, okay, from about 25 on, which is what people usually use to talk about homosexuality and why homosexuality is against God's law, okay? It says that men have changed the truth of God into a lie and worshipped and served the creature more than the Creator, who is blessed forever. For this cause God gave them up to vile affections, for even their women did change the natural use into that which is against nature. And likewise also men, leaving the natural use of the woman, burned in their lust one toward another. Men with men working that which is unseemly, and receiving themselves that which that recompense of their error which was meat. This is King James English here, but I'm just going to have, that's just 25 through 27. I'm going to leave it to your readers, listeners to look at the rest. But over the last, say, 40, 50 years, there have been all sorts of different approaches to that passage. What do we do with this? This is an out-and-out condemnation in the New Testament by Paul of homosexuality or something else going on? And I'm going to quote from Taylor's essay. Mm-hmm. It says, in broader scholarship, there is a range of options for dealing with how Paul thinks about homosexuality in this passage. Paul is condemning heterosexual people for engaging in homosexual sex, not homosexual people for engaging in homosexual sex. So if you were to look at one of my favorite commentaries on Romans are by a couple of process theologians, John Cobb, who's really famous at Claremont, Dan studied with him, and David Lull, who's a New Testament scholar. And what their reading is more or less this first one, that this is ritual sex going on in temples, where people who are obsessed with this kind of idolatrous activity, and that's what's going on. So it's not an out-and-out.
What people might call hedonism.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So it's not a condemnation of homosexuality per se. Okay, that's one, and there are a whole set of scholars who have come up that position. Okay, second possibility. Paul is condemning same-sex intercourse amongst men and women and also lesbianism. So that's the conservative view. This is an out-and-out condemnation of homosexuality. 3, same-sex acts merely illustrate. Now, this is what he says is Jim Faulkner, Adam Miller, and Joe Spencer's position. Same-sex acts merely illustrate the universal fall of humanity rather than a particularly egregious sin. So, and that also works into the, that's kind of close to the first one. That
So
what we've
pick that one to talk about. He could have picked a myriad of other things that are a condition of the fall of humanity.
Right.
He just happened to pick that topic.
Yeah, and if you look at some, like Joe Spencer's book For Zion, book on I think you guys published it.
We did.
A Mormon Theology of Hope. Okay, that's the way Joe pretty well takes it in there. Adam's book, Rube Goldberg Machines, which you guys also published, sort of skips it. Okay, doesn't deal with that issue.
I think he does more in Letters to a Young Mormon, which which he published through Maxwell Institute and Deseret Book.
Yeah. So that's one way of approaching it. 1 and 3 are kind of alike. Now, the fourth position, and this is what I really find interesting about this discussion, is more or less Taylor's position. It's a critical position. Paul is expressing a mythological worldview and gendered hierarchy in his origin story for same-sex intercourse, so that we can criticize Paul. Paul's a man of his time. He has the mythology. He's steeped in the mythology of his time, and that's part of what's going on here.
So had Paul lived today and was writing this today, maybe he would have had a slightly different approach. Yes. But because he is a man of his times, this is his worldview. Yeah.
You think of
or as in, like it might say in Big Lebowski, well, that's just your opinion, man.
Sort of. I love the Big Lebowski. It's my favorite, one of my favorite movies. But sort of that. I mean, he wants to take it more serious than that. He wants to say that no.
I'm teasing a little.
Yeah, I know. We have to engage this. This is the sacred text. This is the canonical scripture. But think of the way we approach this. We believe in the Bible as far as it is translated correctly. Mormons have argued about this forever. What does that mean?
Right.
The Book of Mormon certainly doesn't talk about same-sex relations. So is because Paul is talking about all sorts of stuff that we don't buy. Like the what are they called? The aeons who live in the air between heaven and earth, who are evil beings. Right. I mean, we even miss that. That is so foreign to the way we think as moderns that we don't even notice that it's going on when he's explicitly talking about it in 4 or 5 different places. Right. So, do we have to literally believe that there are demons living in the air between heaven and earth? I once heard Hugh Nibley talk about a really interesting interpretation of what that could possibly mean, but it's but most of us never touch it. Whereas, and if we did, we'd say, well, Paul is a man of his time. This is a really goofy idea. Why is he, he really should be talking about something else here.
LGBT issues is relevant to us today.
Yeah.
Then we're more inclined to say, well, no, we need to pay more attention to this. Past Paul, as opposed to his mythological construction of aeons and things like that.
Yeah, it's the same thing as when we go back, another kind of justification for not extending full fellowship to LGBT people, as the Methodists just had this fight last week, and
Right.
it's hurting. They'll go back to the Torah, and they'll look at certain passages in Leviticus and say, this is actually anti-homosexual, and yet we don't talk about sewing different types of clothing together,
Right.
and
Or things like that.
yeah, there's what you're doing is you've got to say that there, and this is where, for me anyway, personalism is helpful, is that you think that, when Jesus says the first commandment is to love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, mind, and strength, and the second is likened to it, to love your neighbor as yourself, that there are certain things that are more important than other things, and we have to deal with those. Well, like, for example, in the church, we do this all the time with different things, like the difficult passages where Jesus says to the fellow that he can't bury his father. He has to follow him. Let the dead bury the dead. He who has a mother or father. I mean, for us who are so family oriented, we just kind of read that and go and skip it. So we're doing this already.
This applies to us. This one doesn't apply to us. We do it by nature.
We do.
Rabbi Shmuley, I think it was Rabbi Shmuley Boteach, if I remember his name right. Anyway, he'd made the same argument that said there were well over 300 Levitical codes.
Right.
And he said, so what, how do I respond to an to a gay or a lesbian couple that come to me seeking counsel and advice? He said, well, first I want you to perfect all the other 300 codes. And once you have those worked out, then come talk to me.
Yeah, right? That's a good point. That's a good point. So yeah, what Taylor tries to do here is to, attack that idea. So we have those four options. And they're all kind of what William James used to call live options, meaning that they're out there on the table, and because the scriptures are important to us, it's important that we think them through.
Right.
I think that's what I really like about this issue. We get people thinking these through.
Right.
Some of the, I think, best people doing Mormon theology right now are thinking through, attempting to think through some really important issues.
Right. Yeah, I agree with you. I think that if you are interested in really the most cutting edge dialogue on the theological issues of LGBT acceptance within the church, I think that this issue is reflective of the most cutting edge of what on the forefront right now of this conversation. And there's some great contributors to it that are well respected for their theological takes, both within believing circles and within critical circles as well. So I would highly recommend it for that dialogue alone. Now I think we're going to need to wrap up here pretty quickly.
Yeah, we need to talk a little bit about the conference next week.
Yeah, I wanted to hit that next. So let me just give some details of the conference, and I'll let you fill in. So the conference is being held Thursday, March 14th, which is coming up, through Saturday, March 16th. Now, this, for those of you who are watching this on Facebook Live, you're getting this information now. For those of you who are going to be listening to this through our podcast, you may not get this until early next week. So this is coming up very quickly. Thursday, March 14th through Saturday, March 16th at the University of Utah in Salt Lake City. Did we figure out where it's being housed at the university?
Yeah, Margaret Toscano is head of the World Literatures and Cultures department there. And so it's taking place in the, it's the Language and Communication Building. Languages and Communication
Building. Okay. And I'll make sure that when we post this on our webpage, I'll make sure to mention that it's in the Language and Communication Building.
Now it starts. Oh, go ahead.
No, go. You go ahead. That's where I was going to go.
It starts at 7:30 on Thursday evening, and The first
Is that a
talk,
keynote then, or?
yeah, is a keynote by Jane Hathan, who taught at the University of Nevada. Okay, and her title is Nor Any Matter of Ites, Indigeneity and the Book of Mormon. So that should be a fascinating, how do indigenous people approach this book?
Right.
Is the Book of Mormon a kind of, it's often criticized from the outside as being a kind of piece of colonialist literature, that you're imposing this kind of Western American notion,
the notion of great society and
on
disappeared and things like that.
Right.
That's a very interesting question to ask right now when we are institutionally distancing ourselves from the Book of Mormon being a story of all ancient Americans, right? The progenitors of all Native Americans, to being among the ancient Americans, because the big question left after that is, well, what about our heritage, which, in the Polynesian areas, which we were told that we have Lamanite descendancy, or what about our heritage over here? There's always with everything, every time that we seem to progress on an issue, and I'm going to use that term very loosely, but every time that we seem to progress on an issue and say, okay, well, that may be a bit more of a rational take to say that Book of Mormon people were among the principal ancestors and weren't themselves the principal ancestors, there's always a negative consequence.
We've told these people for years that you are the Lamanites, you're the descendants of Israel, and now we're taking that
away from them.
Maybe not.
Maybe not. Right. And and when you look at places like Tonga, which is a predominantly Mormon island, right? I mean, we've got a 50% plus membership rate over in Tonga among all their citizens. That's a huge, huge deal for them to suddenly feel like they're not connected to the Book of Mormon the way that their generations before them felt.
Yeah, for about 25 years, I was a member of the Cherokee Ward in Cherokee, North Carolina. And, this was the big deal, that we were the descendants of these biblical peoples. It's an interesting thing because it cuts in so many different directions. One way, that's kind of anti-colonialist, if you put it down somewhere in Mesoamerica in a very limited geography, you've kind of cut the legs out from under the people who claim that it's all about the United States, which I like seeing that happen. That it's all about white people in the United States.
Well, because there is this other movement taking place, and that's the Heartlander theory, which tends to take on a very nationalistic identity of God's chosen people, and so therefore colonialism was God's chosen way of restoring the gospel, and it continues to move forward into this kind of nationalist identity today. So there's danger in that, in my opinion. there's danger when you follow that line too far. So it's there's a lot of very interesting philosophical questions to be asked about.
Well, and the whole topic of the meeting is quoting Book of Mormon. Normally I've written a paper on this, so normally I could do this off the top of my head, and now it's just ran away. I think it's First Nephi 31 or 28, where know you not there are more nations than one.
Right.
We have the Bible, a Bible. We have a Bible. We have no need of other things, and that's such an interesting passage because we never quote the whole thing. I will speak to the Nephites and they will write it, and I will speak to the Jews and they will write it, and then they go down and he goes, I will speak to the people of the north and south, the east and west, and they will write it, and they will be judged out of the books that they write. So if I have family right now that are Hindu, they're going to be judged out of the Mahabharata and the Vedas. They're not going to be judged by the Book of Mormon. So it's one of the subjects of the conference is how do we approach religious pluralism? You know, there are about as many Mormons in the world as there are Jews. We're a very small group when you look at 7 billion people. There are like 17 million of us, and most of us don't go to church. But you know, so does God only care about those few? Well, according to the Book of Mormon, that's not the case. He cares about them all. And it's not just we are going to convert them all or even baptize them all for the dead later. But
Yeah.
they have received a message. So, what does that mean? And that's what a lot of the papers in the conference are about.
Wonderful. And some of the highlights that I saw, Margaret Toscano, of course, Brian Birch will be presenting, Bob Millett. A lot of people know who he is.
Yeah, Bob Millett and Janice Allred. What other conference could you get with had both Janice and Bob at the same place? Noel Reynolds, Sam Brown. A lot of people know Sam's work. It should be. We've got some new people as well that are coming. It's. I'm really looking forward to it.
So once again, that's Thursday, March 14th through Saturday, March 16th, University of Utah. And the
Literature and Communication Building starts 7:30 on Thursday and then runs 9 to about 9 to 9 on Friday and then 9 to 5 on Saturday.
I'm just typing this out for in a Facebook comment here while we're on Facebook Live. SMPT, and that's free to attend. And the schedule will be posted on
the website. Yeah. We should have had it up by now, but that's living in the clouds. It's a problem.
I did put a link to smpT.org, so hopefully within the next few days, or by the time that this episode comes out through our podcast feed, hopefully that information will be updated on there. Okay, so finally, I just want to wrap this up. We teased this at the beginning. I don't have as much time to get into this as I was hoping that we would, but we've had a great conversation about a lot of things.
Thank you.
But
I've enjoyed talking to you. Really enjoyed it.
The big question that strikes me is that there seems to be a certain amount of ambivalence among Latter-day Saints towards philosophy and theology. I think at the same, on the one hand, we're intrigued by it, and whenever somebody like Terrell Givens comes out with a pretty philosophically rich book, or at least the history of philosophy, we respond to it pretty well. Adam Miller's work, people respond to it pretty well. On the other hand, there's this kind of skepticism, I think, towards it among Latter-day Saints. And I just want to talk about, let's just call it the elephant in the room. What's the point? Why do we need philosophy and theology in Mormonism? Isn't general conference enough?
Okay, let me start out with my own personal experience. When I got home from my mission, I went to study philosophy at BYU. And Jim Faulconer was a young professor at BYU. And we were sitting down in the basement. We were in the basement of the Joseph Smith Memorial. We were underneath the religion department, literally. Okay. And we were sitting around.
Metaphorical as well, right?
Yeah, it's all there. And we were sitting there reading Martin Heidegger's Being and Time. And one of the brothers in the religion department walked by and looked in the Jim's office and said, studying the philosophies of men, I see. Jim didn't even look up. He said, yeah, but at least we don't mingle them with scripture. I love the guy ever since. The problem is it's going to happen, that everybody interprets. People who say they don't interpret don't see what they're doing. And this is one of...
How can you not interpret?
Yeah, right? You read the books. They're translated. Translations are interpretations. But this is another thing I love about Terrell's Wrestling the Angel. In the 19th century, they loved this.
Right. Within Mormonism, we're talking.
Within Mormonism, the early guys, Parley, Orson, Brigham, Joseph, they were into this stuff. They absorbed stuff all over the place and brought it in. I love the quote from Brigham Young that anything that's true is Mormonism.
Yeah.
Yeah, and he also said you don't have to believe anything that isn't true. So which is a good thing to remember. Now, what happened seems to happen about the time we enter the larger society. William Chamberlain's story is a really nice cautionary tale here, because he goes to BYU and he's teaching evolution. He's teaching higher criticism of the scripture, and gets in trouble. And there's some of the brethren that back him and some of the brethren that don't. But he and his brother and a couple of other people, this is in 1911, end up having to leave the university. Chamberlain's story is really tragic. He doesn't leave till 1916, but he kind of, his life just kind of, he dies in the flu epidemic of 1921. I have a letter from David O. McKay apologizing to his brother Ralph for what happened to him, for him being ostracized. And not only that, his brother Ralph Chamberlain, who was the head of the biology department at the University of Utah, wrote a biography of William Chamberlain that in 1925 was required reading for all church educators. So we have this, and there's a really nice discussion of this in Barlow's Mormons in the Bible. So there's this we have this tension that's always been there. I grew up, this is way back in the 70s, and I don't know how many times I heard in church somebody giving a talk about a young missionary who comes back and he's all pure and he's a faithful member of the church, and he goes up to the University of Utah and takes Philosophy 101, and that's the end of the story.
That's Sterling McMurray.
Yeah, exactly. He apostatizes, and that's it. The thing is, you're either going to get good philosophy or you're going to get bad philosophy. And it's not for everybody. I'm not saying everybody should go out and read philosophy, but if it's good for a lot of us. I wouldn't still be a Mormon if not for philosophy. I'd have left years ago.
It's not the free coffee at the end of the service that keeps you in.
No. Although coffee is pretty wonderful.
No, but and my goal here isn't to say that everybody needs to become interested in philosophy.
No, of course not.
But I do think that
a lot of us need it.
And also I think that we can be we can understand its purpose a little bit better, its usefulness, its utility, as it were, within our faith tradition, because we are a faith tradition that doesn't have a professionalization of theology, right? We don't have professional theologians who are under the institutional employment to read scripture through a theological lens.
Yeah.
Right. We have we have administrators, right? And I say that with all kindness, right? We have administrators who are vitally important, but they're not necessarily looking at things through a theological and a philosophical lens, right?
One of the things that I've always thought was interesting about Mormonism, about being a Latter-day Saint, I guess we're not supposed to say Mormonism anymore, but is that we have incredible centrifugal and centripetal forces moving us. Everybody's supposed to be open to revelation, and yet we're also supposed to have this strongly centralized authority structure.
Right.
And that tension is what makes Mormonism. Because if we go one way where everybody just speaks for themselves, we will wander off into chaos. But if we go the other way, where the authority is everything, that was in our mythology. That was the bad guy's plan. Took away your freedom and doesn't want you to think anymore. Just wants you to follow the commandment.
Which is, I mean, there's a famous, I guess you can almost call it a gaffe from N. Eldon Tanner, right? When he wrote that when the prophets have spoken, the thinking's been done, and Kimball pulled him aside pretty quickly after that and said, I'm not thrilled with that message, right? It kind of negates this idea of free agency, and he did issue an apology, but that apology was really to the 12, right? And it didn't really get broadcast out. But it's been a concept that's been passed down from generation to generation, that whatever the brethren say, the thinking's been done. All you need to do is get yourself into accordance with that, which, I mean, there is a strength in unity, right? And I think one of the successes of Mormonism, and I'm not too shy to use that word, is this strength of unity that has kind of kept it through cycles of persecution to being on the opposite end, where we're almost assimilating and diffusing into society, right?
Yeah.
But so there is a definite utility in that acceptance. But at the same time, like you said, personal revelation requires meditating on things and thinking them through for yourself, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's where the role of philosophy and theology is really beneficial, is being able to kind of chew these things apart in a very deep and rich way, beyond kind of, in my own experience, our superficial kind of means of, well, if I just read a couple chapters of scripture per day, right, then everything's going to be fine. And so we check the mark, do a little checkbox. Well, I read the first and second chapters.
Billy used to say we get our little gold star and we put it on our forehead, and we've done it.
But it's not helping us to really dissect what's going on. All we're doing is just processing the words, right? It's just flowing through our brains, and then we move on with our day. We're not really dissecting and chewing on what's going on. And so that's where I think, particularly, when we're talking about relevant social topics, such as how do we deal with the issue of having gay and lesbian members who want to be in full fellowship with the church, right? These are extremely vital and important issues to discuss. Literally, lives are at stake, and this is where we have an opportunity to have these really kind of open conversations with one another, and with people who think very deeply about these things. So that's where I think where this issue of element really can benefit people.
Yeah, one last thing. Years ago, there was a famous Sunstone article that came up with the metaphor of iron rod Mormons and Leahona Mormons.
Right. Yeah.
And I've always been really I think that's really valuable, but I'm also really uncomfortable with it because I don't think it captures. We can read that story of the iron rod in so many ways, because if you think about it. What the folks who are holding to the rod are doing is they're going through darkness, and this is all they've got to hold on to. And it's not that they're marching along with confidence. They're struggling. And that's the meaning of the word Israel, to struggle with God and win. To struggle with God and man and win. So we're like Gibbon's title, Wrestling the Angel. Depending on how you read that passage, it's wrestling God, not just the angel. Right. But to struggle along the rod is to struggle along it. It's not to just kind of grab on and skip your way up to the tree of life. And that means you've got to be thinking, you've got to be trying to, recognize that you're there with other people, and some of them might be gay, and some of them might support Donald Trump, but still, you got to live with them.
That's the great experiment, right? What Eugene England talks about, how the church is as true as the gospel is having those relationships, that because in a ward relationship we can actually choose it, unlike our family, but being there and learning how to increase your compassion and your increase your love, and that's the great experiment, right? And that's the great point of the gospel, is magnifying your love, even for those who you politically disagree with, or who you think are not living the kind of lifestyle that you want them to, or whatever misperceptions are and those things. I agree. Well, let's wrap this up. I think we've had a wonderful conversation. I've put a few links in for the Society for Mormon Philosophy and Theology. That's SMPT.org. It's a work in progress. It's being built up. We do have a back catalog of journals for people to take a look at over at gregcofordbooks.com. Also, this episode will be airing. If you didn't catch the whole thing now, you can check it out at youtube.com/gkbooks. You can subscribe to our channel over there. I would highly recommend it. We are trying to build up our subscriber base over there. I'm going to be posting more video content, more interviews, so for people to dig into, having a little bit richer, deeper conversations than just trying to sell you a book. Although we want you to buy the book too. I'd like to thank Jim McLachlan for being my guest today. Again, you can learn more about the Society for Mormon Philosophy and Theology at smpt.org. If you are in Utah, be sure to check out their free conference at the University of Utah running March 14th to the 16th. Be sure to check out the latest issue of Element. You can go to our website at gregcofer.com. We will be putting it up on our front page probably later today. If it's not there, then just type in Element in the search box and it'll come right up. You can subscribe to our podcast through most podcast apps by just searching for Greg Koford Books. You can also find us on Facebook. Obviously, those who are following us right now already know that. You can find us on Twitter and Instagram. Again, just search for Greg Koford Books. And if you like these types of conversations, then, like I mentioned, subscribe to us at YouTube at youtube.com/gkbooks, where we'll be posting more interviews with our authors on a variety of topics, from history to philosophy, theology, and scripture. So subscribe to our channel and be sure to hit that notification bell to be informed whenever we release new content. We want to thank you for watching and for listening.